Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to The Reason We Learn. I'm your host, Deb Philman, and this is the channel where we talk about all things related to education and the growth of the minds of our children, next generation, etc. If you are new to the channel, please consider subscribing. And I would appreciate it if you would like and share this broadcast so we can have more people join us live. And then if you're watching on the replay, thank you for being here. Also consider liking, sharing, and commenting. I have a great guest today. I have Freddie deBoer in our little, window here. He has a fantastic Substack that I discovered through a friend, and I've been reading it pretty religiously for months. He's also the author of a book, The Cult of Smart. And because I've read some of his pieces that pertain to things that I've been talking about on the channel, I asked him to please come and talk to us about them. And so I'm very excited about this. So without further ado, welcome, Freddie.
Thanks for having me.
You're so welcome. You're doing me a favor, really. So as I mentioned before we went live, the piece that resonated with me so much was when you wrote back in the end of April 27th, nobody walks around feeling valid. Stop creating impossible emotional expectations for our culture. I would love for you to just talk about what you wrote in that piece. I'm directing everyone to read it, by the way, but at the same time, I'd love to hear from you, your thoughts on this topic.
Sure. So the piece is a response to the concept of validity, of personal validity, which has arisen specifically in response to particular issues of identity and complaints that people from marginalized identities are made to feel invalid or less valid than other people. I don't doubt and have never doubted that there's all manners of ways in which people from various minority groups are in some sense disrespected or sidelined by our society. But the problem with fixating so much on saying, well, Black people are made to feel invalid, women are made to feel invalid, trans people are made to feel invalid, etc., is that it implies that there is some alternative. And that the alternative is that people who belong to dominant identities walk around feeling great about themselves all the time. And as a white straight man, I can tell you that I certainly don't walk around on a cloud of positive feelings about myself. None of the white straight men that I know and am close with do either. And it just, I think that it is a classic example of failing to understand that it's perfectly possible for one group to be in some sense disadvantaged without imagining that things are great on the other side. And in particular, this idea of validity, I don't know what that word means. I don't know what it would mean to feel valid. I don't know on what scale we are considering the questions of being valid or invalid. It seems to me to be intentionally vague for the purpose of, being better able to be integrated into Instagram memes, right? So, part of the reason that this is an important issue to me is that it's very, very prevalent in social media, particularly social media for young people, Instagram, TikTok, Twitter, Tumblr, etc. That on these networks, the concept of you are valid, you should feel valid, is omnipresent, just inescapable. But there's this old meme like, God grant me the confidence of a mediocre white man, right? Which, of course, implies that mediocre white men actually feel confident, and right. most of the white men of any particular level of competence or success that I know don't feel that way. And so I think that just creating an impossible emotional expectation under the guise of doing something for people in terms of like a self-help sort of a scenario. And it's an irony that I've observed over and over again. So even outside of the concept of validity, women's inspirational Instagram memes are something that I have sort of looked on with a sort of grim fascination for many years. And in the past, I've called them sociopath instructions because they are basically telling people to live as if they are the only human being who exists. They are all about how you have to ruthlessly pursue your goals and your desires and your dreams, how nothing else matters, how you shouldn't let anything like concern for other people get in the way of what you want. And among other things, I mean, number one, I think that that is a socially not a good message for us to be giving to anyone, because we live in a community and we have to be mindful of the fact that other people's interests are as important as ours are, but also because it doesn't work, right? Like the women wouldn't constantly be posting these memes if they actually felt the way that they, are pretending to feel, right? I mean, one of the things that I believe is universally true is that people who feel compelled to tell you that they're strong are weak, right? Because actually strong people don't bother to try to broadcast that fact. And so this is all very new and tied to sort of identity politics in one sense, and to current contemporary social media norms. But it's also part and parcel with the self-esteem movement, which really got going in the 1970s. And was connected to all manner of sort of weird schools of philosophy and meditation. And I think Est was something that
that was big then.
It was part of, all this stuff. And again, like back then, the terminology change was different, but the basic idea was the same, which is that like your job is to feel good about yourself all the time. Like self-esteem, if you have self-esteem, you care about yourself and you respect yourself and you love yourself, etc. And the first problem with that is that there's been a lot of studies done, and there's no correlation between someone's sense of self-esteem and their overall level of personal success. There's no correlation between self-esteem and how well they treat other people, right? Like people who love themselves treat others well is one of the baked into this ideology, but it doesn't appear to be true. But again, also, it's perverse in the sense that loving yourself is just something else you can fail at, right?
Yeah.
So if you talk about, like, if you look at, like, how gendered this dialogue has become and how intensely focused it is in women's spaces online, the commandment to love yourself becomes just another bar that women can't clear, right? It just becomes another expectation that society puts on women that is not realistic or fair. And I find that, like I said, perverse, right? It is the desire to love yourself becomes something that you can't achieve. And because of that, you hate yourself.
Right. Right. And I think there's still, while it's not as explicit with boys and men, there's a lot of hate directed at men. And then the self-esteem movement for women implies, and sometimes it's explicit, there's a barrier created by men, like that men are in the way of your self-esteem. And then if you're a man, the message to you is get out of the way. And the guy might be going, I'm not in your way. Like, I don't care, go do your thing. So much of it feels aggressively antagonistic, even while it's saying to one side, go feel good about yourself. I pick up and you guys are the problem. Right. And so now you've got men also feeling like I'm being made to feel responsible for something I'm not even involved with at all.
Right. I mean, I think the irony of it is that there's a long history within the feminist movement and within women's spaces of the biggest enemy being other women in practical terms. So Grace Atkinson, who was a second wave feminist, a contemporary of Shulamith Firestone in that group, she has a famous line, which is, sisterhood is powerful. It kills mostly sisters, right? Which, and there was a famous article called Trashing that came out in that era too, which I think was it Joe Freeman? I'm trying to think of who wrote it. Anyway, but it was all about how, the biggest impediment to success for the second wave feminists was the incredible amount of infighting and tearing down of each other that happened, right? So, yeah, there is a sense in which patriarchy, right, is the thing that is keeping women from feeling good all the time. I think patriarchy, to be honest with you, is quite indifferent to whether women feel good about themselves. In fact, I think
completely agree.
Yeah, I mean, I think that to the degree that patriarchy exists, and it does exist in some ways and to some degree, but to the degree to which patriarchy exists, it would rather women feel great about themselves, even as the power dynamics remain what they are. But Um, women are, there's a notorious tendency among some women to be unable to maintain both the sense of being a driven person who has value and self-esteem and wants to take care of themselves, and also to be unable to avoid carrying each other down. So I don't think that the problem is gendered. I think the problem again is that what I would always say to anyone is, who told you that you were entitled to love yourself, right? Like, to me, that just seems like a very weird thing even to desire, let alone to demand, right? I am someone who enjoys now a pretty good deal of physical comfort, of socioeconomic security. I live in Brooklyn and enjoy an enviable life. And, I'm a published author and I have a PhD. But I don't walk around feeling self-love because that's just weird to me, right? Like that's not the deal that we're sort of handed as human beings. I think that avoiding punishing depression or anxiety, both of which are medical conditions that I think can be effectively treated with modern medicines and with therapy in some situations. I think that I get. But like the notion that I'm supposed to just exist in a default state of liking myself is very alien to me, right? I go about my day, I feel pretty good if things are going good. If they're not, I feel pretty bad. But I don't have this sort of ambient sense of like self-love that pervades everything. And I just think that that's not a normal thing to want. I mean, not to get too big picture, but it's always worth reminding people that for 300,000 years, we evolved in an environment in which we were hunter-gatherers who lived in small bands of maybe 20 people at the most, who roamed across the plains and had to watch out for being attacked by saber-toothed tigers and gathering nuts and berries, and just had very small social worlds and just a profoundly different environment. Agriculture and civilization are maybe 10 to 12,000 years old. So we lived like that for vastly longer than we've lived like this. And we had much, much more time to evolve, including our brains, according to that environment. So if you say, why is anxiety so endemic in contemporary society? Well, again, anxiety makes a lot of sense. If you are at significant risk of being eaten by an animal, at any particular time, right? You want to be in a state of constant watchfulness. Now we find ourselves in this environment that's not suited to us. So again, for 300,000 years, we lived in a very calorie poor environment, right? It was hard to get your hands on enough food to survive. Now we live in an impossibly calorie dense environment. So it's not surprising that we have epidemics of obesity and high blood pressure, etc. Right? But it's also the same with the mind, right? Where one of the things we all have to reconcile is that we have minds that are still, we have brains at least that are that evolved to fit conditions of the Stone Age, and we live in vastly different circumstances. And even in the last 25, 30 years, you have the rise of the internet, which has dramatically upscaled the number of relationships that everyone has to be managing at all times. Again, we don't know that our brain is meant to do that. So, I mean, self-love just seems like, I don't know why you would beat yourself up about needing to feel it.
Right. And you described it in the piece. You said it's important to point out that we're born in terror. We exist for no reason. I know there's people who argue with that, but whatever. Right. We experience confusion and shame as children. That's something I try to explain to parents all the time. Like, this is normal. Mm-hmm. This is completely normal. Like, in reminding your children, this is part of growing up and maturing. It's not some horrible thing they have to fix. And, it says, we busily prepare ourselves for lives we don't want or can't have. We're forced to take on the burdens of adult responsibility. We compromise relentlessly on what life we pursue. We settle and settle and settle. We fear death and ponder our meaningless, etc. And the thing that you've just described, some people will say like, oh gosh, what a bummer. But let's be real here. That's just reality. You're also born in poverty. I mean, we're all, but like what you have comes from the effort of your parents or grandparents or you or whatever, or the people around you. You're not born into a state of being by virtue of anything else. It's been the effort of other people. And we seem to be so resistant to accepting these basic realities, and we're now teaching our children their problems that have to be solved. And the earlier we get to you to solve them, the more likely we'll be able to do it. They seem to completely reject something you mentioned before the show started, which is nature. And you've just hinted at it right now. Can you expound on that a little bit more about how we're born? Because you talked about personality too.
Yeah, I mean, first, I think that one of the things I encountered when I was writing and promoting my first book was that people are very resistant to being reminded that they are fundamentally animals, and that we don't have any special endowment that lets us escape, part of the basic broken deal of being alive. And part of that is that our genes, which we don't choose and can't control, have profound impacts on who we are and the lives that we lead. This remains controversial because people really don't want to hear it. But there's an overwhelming amount of research that suggests that many of our personality traits are, in fact, influenced by genes, and in some sense, intrinsic and unchangeable. So there's no reason to believe that we can take fundamentally anxious and shy people and make them calm and confident people, right? There's never been any reason to think that that's true. We carry around this sort of vaguely Freudian idea that, everything about our personalities depends upon things that happen to us very early in childhood, and it's all about these early traumas, and they shape us and make us who we are. There's never really been any evidentiary basis for that. Freud certainly never thought that he had to have any evidence for anything that he said, but that idea sort of haunts the species. And we all have our burdens to bear in terms of who we are. I don't advocate nihilism in terms of improving yourself or making yourself happier or changing your life. I think that people can do that. But you have to understand that it's just like your body, right? If someone is 300 pounds and they want to get down to 275 pounds, I think that that's a good goal, and that, with a lot of hard work and care, they can probably do it. If somebody is 300 pounds and they want to get down to 180 pounds, I would say that goal in and of itself is not realistic, and you're going to end up doing more harm to yourself than good. If I had decided when I was 5 years old that I wanted to be an Olympic sprinter, that I wanted to run the 100 meters, it doesn't matter if I had trained every day of my life from that point forward, if I had the best coaching you could possibly have, the best training and nutrition, etc., I would never have gotten anywhere close to the podium, right? Because that's not my nature. I'm not physically able to do that. People accept those things, right? We have a growing understanding that while we want people to be as healthy as they can be, there is a degree to which your weight is out of your control, right? In which your genes are predisposing you to a particular outcome. With the mind, people will not accept that. With personality, they won't accept that, right? I mean, this is, I always say that there's only one bit of wisdom we ever learn about our romantic relationships, right? The one lesson is always the same, which is you can't change the other person, right? But we desperately want to, right? We always think, okay, he's great. He's got everything I need. I just need to make him much more thoughtful and less sloppy and much more caring. And right. And then when I get that, everything's going to be great. But we have to relearn over and over again. You can't do that, right? You cannot make the other person into something that they're not.
And the person you could do that to, you probably wouldn't want when you were done.
Right.
I mean, if somebody is that malleable.
Right. Yeah, it would be a little scary. Yeah. But it's the same way with ourselves, right? I have bipolar disorder. I spent 15 years of my life in and out of psychiatric hospitals. It took me a long time to accept that I could get into treatment, and I am in treatment and have been for 5 years, which is great, and that I can make better or worse choices, but I can't turn that off. There's nothing I can do to make myself not be that way. And I wish people would accept the fact that there are fundamental aspects of themselves that, as much as they may not like them, they probably can't really change them. So how can I find ways to mitigate those things that I can actually do in my real life? And I think that that applies to the commandment to love yourself, which is that, like, okay, I don't feel great about myself. If I think back, to be honest, I've never felt great about myself. I didn't feel great about myself the day that I got into Yale or whatever somebody might do. I didn't feel great about myself the day I graduated from med school. I didn't feel great about myself the day I married my high school sweetheart. These things don't suddenly, we feel good, we feel happiness, but we don't suddenly have a personality change where we start loving ourselves. So maybe I can accept it's not about events and it's not about what I succeed in doing, that there's some baseline in me, right? That of how good I feel about myself on a day-to-day basis. And yeah, there are some people out there who just sort of walk around feeling good about themselves. And you know what? Good for them, right? Like they're the lucky ones. But the rest of us have to ask, is it worth investing a lot of psychic energy into worrying about, can I start to love myself? Or should I put that someplace more fruitful? Try to be good to myself when I can, right? Like think of the simple things that I do in my life that make me feel better rather than worse, and do those things. But to give up on this project, right? To just to have to feel good all the time. But the problem is, anyone who has that thinking just has to open Instagram, right? Has to open TikTok, and they're being assaulted again with the idea that if they're not loving themselves all the time, they're failing, which I just think is just gross.
And they're being encouraged into groupings or labels that they're told make them valid or will give them validity because they command the world to accept them. Right. People are pretty savvy, and especially if you're told, like, hey, you want to feel better in your own skin, these are the groups that have some protection. These are the groups that people now have to celebrate, not just, validate, but celebrate and defer to and so forth. And if you're, let's say, a preteen or a teenager, and that's hard enough for, any of us, right? And somebody like TikTok or the teacher at school says, we have to accept this, we have to accept these people, we have to treat these people a certain way, then the impulse to become one of those people or emulate one of those people is probably fairly intense. And I know I'm going to ruffle feathers saying that, but we used to know it when it was being a jock or being, a punk or being whatever. Mm-hmm. And now when you mention it and say, well, maybe it has to do with some of the gender affirmation stuff or whatever, people, oh my God, no, that's intrinsic. They just feel like that. I'm like, okay, tell me what it feels like to be a man. What does it feel like to be a woman? Right. And I when I see this validation thing, I can't help but feel like they're told they should be validated to feel good about themselves because they're told they should be feeling good about themselves. Mm-hmm. And it's just, follow that path to where we are.
Well, I mean, look at, when I was in my late 20s, I worked for a couple of years for the public school district in my local, my hometown. And one of the things that I did for several months is I worked in a special education classroom. And there was a couple of kids there who were autistic, one of them was very severely restricted in what she could do or say. The other one was completely nonverbal, couldn't go to the bathroom by himself, was debilitated by this condition. And I used to talk to his mom when she would come to get him. And this was in 2008 or so. And so it is prior to the sort of rise of modern identity stuff when it comes to autism. But she was very, very, she had a very dark view of the autism awareness industry, right?
Interesting.
She said that she would say that, what does awareness do for me, right? How does awareness help me deal with a child who every indication, this kid was by now like 11 years old. Every indication was that he was going to spend the rest of his life needing constant and intense support. And to her, awareness was just a dodge, a way to sort of try to put a pretty face on was a terrible disability. Well, now in 2022, you can't even call autism a disability. So there was just a panel at Harvard that was canceled because it referred to treatment of autism. And students said that to speak of treatment is violently ableist, is the word term that they used, and that there can be no treatment for autism because there's nothing wrong with autism. Autism is not a deficiency or a disability; it's just a different way of being. When I hear that, I think back to that mother who had to spend her life dealing with a severely disabled child, always feeling that there wasn't adequate support for him. And I wonder what she would possibly think about that, right? Unfortunately, the existence of people with severe autism, with people who have faced really major disabilities that preclude their ability to succeed academically, that preclude their ability to hold down a job, that make it much harder for them to have any kind of romantic relationships, they're not out there writing essays for BuzzFeed or whatever, right? Like the people who have the wherewithal to be able to create the public face of autism now are people who whose autism is mild and doesn't produce those kinds of very really severe restrictions. And so they're telling a story about autism that it's just a quirky personality trait. And it says, now I have absolutely no interest in saying that people who have mild autism and whose personalities manifest themselves that way, that there's anything that they should be doing differently. It's not my business. I don't care, right? But first of all, I think that if you refuse to call something a disability, then you abdicate your right to demand accommodation, right? So when we give people accommodations for disabilities, right, the Americans with Disabilities Act of 1990, it says that, the legal standard is we need to provide every reasonable accommodation, which is important, not any possible accommodation, but any reasonable accommodation. But that is that legal standard and that social understanding stems from the fact that we acknowledge that disabilities are disabilities, right? They are deficiencies and to sometimes truly debilitating and disabling, and that people can't control it. And under those auspices, we give accommodations. If you're going to say there's nothing wrong with me, I don't have a disability, then I think that you've given up the standing to be able to say I demand an accommodation. Again, neuroatypicality is. I just wrote about this recently. It was originally used to speak about autism. People have sort of thrown more and more disorders into it. It depends on whose definition you look at, but some people include schizophrenia and bipolar disorder and even anxiety and depression. And I cannot imagine a world in which I would assign myself the laurel of neuroatypicality. But more importantly, I would give anything to be neurotypical, right? My bipolar disorder has cost me immensely in my life. There are a number of lifelong friendships that I've lost because of my behavior under that, in that standing. Did immense professional damage to myself, academic damage, etc. And it sucks, and I hate it. And I never stop wishing that I didn't have it, right? And the notion that I'm supposed to love it, right? Then the notion that it's not enough that I have to suffer with it, but now the commandment is that I must love myself and apparently every aspect of myself, right? Is bizarre and insulting to me. And I would never tell someone that they have to love their diabetes and treat that as an identity, right? I mean, it's the same thing for me, right? You can call yourself whatever you want, but don't demand that I see something that has cost me so much in my life as some sort of like secret advantage, because it's not.
Right. And that's a really good point. And I think one that not enough people question. The demand is made. It's made loudly and very, publicly and often. And so a lot of people just go along with it because I think we have as a society an addiction to being perceived as nice. And the nice gets defined by other people. too much. It's kind of like whether it's mass media, whatever it is, it's like, this is what it means to be a good person, a nice person. You will validate, you will celebrate, you will do these things. And so if you're if you're just questioning it and saying, why should I? Even just asking the question, but why? I don't want to. I disagree. You're now horrible. Like, you're a bigot, you're a hater, you're ableist, you're all those things. And when I think of children who are just figuring out the world, they're brand new here, right? Mm-hmm. And they go to school, or they're dealing with all the media bombarding them. And I did learn the other day, it's about, to your point earlier, it's about 20 lifetimes worth of information compared to someone born in 1910. Right. So if you just take that as a measurement, it's about 20 lifetimes worth of just verbal information, not just forget visual. And so, I'm just trying to imagine, I remember being a kid very well and all the confusion associated. Now I'm trying to jettison myself into today as that same kid, with these people saying, this is what it means to be good, and this is what you have to do, and this is what you have to celebrate. When would I have the quiet and the space in my own head to just come to terms with what I am, to even just figure out what I am in there, and not just, I can't imagine that.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I thank God that I grew up without social media. I don't know. I mean, I don't know how I would have developed a healthy sense of self if my brain was constantly rubbing up against the brain of my peers at all times. And I really do feel for these kids. Yeah, I mean, I agree with you that there's probably no political solution to these problems. I do think that it's going to become more and more obvious that these social networks and the constant internet connectivity and the smartphones really is doing an immense amount of damage to developing brains. And, a guy like Jonathan Haidt, who has published repeatedly, showing that there is like a causal negative effect on all manner of psychological indicators by having access to social media. At some point, I hope somebody comes up with a drastic solution. I would gladly. The problem is it's unenforceable. But if it was enforceable, I would gladly ban social media for anybody under the age of 18, because I just think that these kids aren't prepared to know. I mean, the thing is human beings always have and have always had a problem with being overly invested in the opinion of others, particularly when it comes to their own worth or value, right? The sort of constant sort of crowdsourced sense of like, I am what other people make of me. Now take that and you're sort of farming that out to thousands and thousands of strangers. I don't know. It really worries me.
Yeah, I agree. And I wanted to ask you your take on the concept being pushed right now in schools, or I shouldn't say concept, the highest value right now is something called equity. Yeah. And you can't look at any of the documentation from the schools around, curriculum, or even with their new self-esteem thing, it's social emotional learning. And it's always connecting social justice to equity. And they have in the equity this feelings component. So they're not talking even, people say, well, it's about equal outcomes, which in and of itself is absurd, because as you pointed out, we're all different, born with different talents, different abilities. And I would love as a teacher and as a parent to just figure out what my kids' unique abilities and talents are and help them, pursue that, not make them equal to all the other kids or all the other kids down to wherever they are. But it's more than that. They're pushing feelings, like everyone should feel a sense of belonging. Everyone should feel X. There's this should and feel next to each other, connected with equity. And that scares the living daylights out of me. I don't even know who came up with that as this is a good idea, but I'm curious what your thoughts on it are.
Yeah, I mean, so like, look, the concept of equity as opposed to equality is that equity means that you do what's necessary to create equal outcomes, even if the treatment is very different. So, I mean, for one thing, it uses a very, I think, dishonest definition of what equality was. So there's this very overused and to me terrible cartoon which shows like equality is some people are peering over the fence some kids are peering over the fence at a baseball game, and they all have one box to stand on, but they have three very different heights. So they have three very different views anyway. That's equality. I don't know of any definition of equality that would ever look at that system and be like, yeah, this is good. Like the idea that equality has heretofore meant like perfectly equal treatment. Like that's never been a notion of equality. That's just the default, right? That's just, not doing anything. So first of all, it's just a bogus sort of contrast. But yeah, equity is about, what are we going to do to have exactly as many Black kids in Harvard as or the Senate or whatever, or getting 1600s on the SATs as white or Asian or anything else. The first thing is that these, in the long run, equity will always fail, right? Like, I think that there are some conservatives who are overly concerned with what about a world where we really do have equality of outcomes?
No, reality is going to win way before that.
Yeah, that's not going to happen, right?
It can't. I mean, planes will fall out of the sky.
Right. I mean, one thing that I mention all the time is that, Marxism has nothing to do with equality, and the assumption that the purpose of Marxism is to establish equality is a completely wrong notion, a complete misconception about what the philosophy is about. And in fact, Marx often talked about the fact that after you go through a Marxist revolution, there's still lots of summative inequality, right? Because people are different, right? The famous Marxist phrase, "from each according to his ability, to each according to his need," contains within it the notion that different people have different strengths, right? And this is the sort of the idea that underlies my whole first book, which is that, demanding equal outcomes from unequal inputs ultimately does more harm to the people who you think you're helping than anyone else.
Yeah, for sure.
It's not going to happen, right? At some point, we have in this country dramatically reduced the high school dropout rate over the past 25 years, with no underlying educational data that would suggest that that's appropriate, right? When you look at the fact that, for example, in 1980 or 1985, Hispanic students, something like almost 4 in 10 Hispanic students were dropping out of high school before graduation. Now it's less than 1 in 10. Across the whole system, and in all racial demographics, the high school graduation rate has dramatically declined. Now it's in the single digits. The dropout rate nationally is, I don't know, I'd have to look it up, but it's like 9 or 8 or 7%. But there's no reason to believe that actually reflects educational growth, right? Like the metrics of success for our seniors, for people at the end of high school, should be getting better if there is reason to believe that this increase in the graduation rate is real, and there is no such data. And so what's happened instead is that for decades and decades, the policy apparatus applied more and more pressure and demanded get these kids out the door. And so schools and teachers responded by just artificially graduating people who shouldn't graduate. Right. They get pushed up into the college system. Yeah. I can tell you, as someone who worked at CUNY, the City University of New York, which has a lot of really great students. It also has community colleges with students who are severely academically underprepared. The pressure to get the kids out the door there is enormous, right? You need to keep the kids in the system. I mean, that's mostly a matter of dollars and cents, right? So schools like CUNY are super exposed to their enrollment rate because they need tuition dollars. They don't have big endowments that they can live off of. So they need tuition dollars, and there's a lot of pressure to keep kids in the system, even when they've demonstrated over and over again that they don't have what it takes to be a college student. The thing is that sooner or later that hurts them, right? Yep. Because you're going to put them out onto the street, and they're going to show up for job interviews, and they're going to have these resumes, and they're going to be given opportunities to demonstrate what they can do. And it's going to be apparent to most of those people doing the hiring that they're not ready, that they don't have the skills that they need. And even if they get a job, when they show up on the job, if you're a computer scientist who can't hack, who can't code,
Exactly.
you will be out on the street. We're not actually helping those kids at all.
No.
Equity has no real end game, right? There's no sense in which it actually helps people the most. The equity is deeply tied to what I call the rainbow oligarchy, right? Which is that what liberalism right now, writ large, appears to be trying to do is to diversify the elite so that it looks proportional to the rest of the country while leaving the vast majority of people unaffected, right? So again, it's more black faces at Harvard, right? It's more black faces in Congress, more black faces in Fortune 500 companies, more women on the board of Fortune 500 companies, more women software engineers at Google, right? All of these are absolutely tiny, completely, separated from normal life for most people. They are elite in every sense. I just don't give a shit, right? Like it's not, I have no interest in a equally diverse Harvard because I know the purpose of Harvard, why Harvard exists, is to perpetuate the class system, right? Like Harvard exists to maintain an elite that sort of lives above all of the rest of us, and I just don't have any interest in that. But the equity project is deeply tied up in this attempt to make everything look representative at the top, so that it will look more just, so that people ask less hard questions about like the fundamental distribution of money and power in this country.
You had a piece, why the fuck do you trust Harvard?
Yeah.
College admissions does, and will always serve only the institutions that are incredible greed. Could you talk a little bit more about that? Because I talk about this college thing. I'm kind of glad you brought it up, because one of the things that gets pushed a lot, and it's used as a justification for many of these pedagogies now, is we have to get them career and college ready. We have to get them career and college ready. And I'm like, why do we have to? And who's we? And why are we treating these kids like they're a we? What about the individual little kid in front of you who may want to be a plumber or a writer or an artist or something else entirely, and you're deciding when they're 3 that the goal of K-12 is to get them career and college ready? It seems, I don't know, just weird.
So look at affirmative action at Harvard, right? Which is a really good indication of what these systems actually value and what they're for. I'm a supporter of race and class-based affirmative action for a variety of reasons. But if you look at what actually happens at a school like Harvard, right? They're not going and finding, budding geniuses in Camden, New Jersey, or Fitchburg, Massachusetts.
They're just holding you up to a Pantone card.
Right. Like the kids who are benefiting from affirmative action at Ivy League schools, they are the first generation children of wealthy African immigrants, right? There's an awful lot of kids whose parents are like Nigerian surgeons who make $300,000 a year. You have there's a lot of you're not supposed to classify international students, so students who literally their citizenship is another country. You're not supposed to classify them as filling diversity slots for affirmative action or other things, but it happens all the time. They'll find ways around it. They have, funny ways to define things. So, you have wealthy kids from Argentina, which is a dominantly white country, right? Who consider themselves white, but who are slotted as Hispanic slots for the diversity metrics, right? I've even seen some of the most incredible, which is that Spanish kids, as in from Spain, are sometimes coded as Hispanic for the purposes.
Yeah, probably. Yeah. That's literally.
Now why? Right? Like why do these schools pursue students who sort of artificially fill a diversity metric whose parents make a lot of money? Well, you have to understand that, Harvard specifically, you don't get a $45 billion endowment to tuition checks, right? Like that's not where their money comes from. Where their money comes from is students whose parents donate and who will go on to be wealthy enough to donate themselves as alumni, right?
Correct.
Um,
Yes.
and so the easiest way to make sure you're going to get a student who does that is find a kid who's already rich, right? And so
Right.
like that to me is a good indication of, the deck is always rigged, right? Like even
Right.
the number of poor uh, American-born descendants of African slaves who are
Mhm.
benefiting from diversity programs at the most elite colleges is very, very small, right? Even though
Right.
that's who is constantly invoked to defend the system.
Right.
And so it's just this notion that we're going to make Harvard or Yale or Princeton, we're going to make these socially just, equitable spaces is a joke, right?
Right.
You go back to when these colleges were founded, there was no notion of social justice being involved in the
Mm-mm.
mission of a college, right? I
Yeah.
mean, the Ivy League, it's specifically was founded in order to train the leaders of tomorrow,
Right.
right?
Mhm.
It was actually not like education was actually not considered to be the highest priority. The idea was these kids are wealthy WASP males who will go on to have positions in the heights of industry or in Congress or whatever. And they need to have a liberal arts education in order to be good at running the country. Um, Over time, right, in the 20th century, a social justice justification was grafted onto our higher education system, right? As a way, oh, this is why you should pay. I mean, we pay something like 2.5 or 3% of GDP, like 2.5% of GDP, like 2.5 cents out of every dollar created in this country goes to higher ed. It's insanely expensive, right? So how do you justify that? Well, you justify it if you say this is no longer a finishing school for elites. Now it's a social justice vehicle.
Oh,
But
it's leveling the playing field. It's letting, people rise up in their, social status, except when you actually look at reality, it isn't really.
right,
I
I
mean, it
mean,
has to a certain degree. You'll always find, people who have, but for the most part, no.
yeah. I mean, the thing is like you can't ask these institutions to go against their fundamental nature, right? I mean, it's like the story of the frog and the scorpion, right?
Right.
And sometimes people ask me like, how can you make admissions at an Ivy League school fair or social justicey or equitable? And I say you can't, right? It's
Make
built
it not
into
an Ivy League school.
right. Well, it's built into the system that is not what they're for. They say, well, what if you had lottery-based admissions? Now, I've said before, like, look, if I could restart the whole American higher education system, then every student, when they graduated from high school, if they want to go to college, they'd submit a postcard-sized form, which is just you list the top 10 schools you want to go to. Um, and you're guaranteed to get admission to at least one of them. And then they're put into a weighted lottery, and the weighting is determined by geography, right? Because one thing that people don't really realize about our system is that something like 80% of students go to school within 30 miles of where they grow up, right? Like for going away for college is quite rare, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, for what that kid wants to study, what does the college do well? What does it need people to fill slots for, etc. I would have some sort of weighting in order to achieve racial and gender diversity, in part because kids don't want to go to schools that have really bad gender bias in one direction or the other, etc. And it would truly be a random system other than that. The problem is, right, if you do that, Harvard ceases to be Harvard, right? Like
That's true.
if you are distributing slots to the elite by lottery, then there no longer is a perceived advantage to go to those schools anyway, right?
Correct.
Harvard's value is its exclusivity. If
Right.
they open their doors, right? I mean, look, these schools have not, in general, have not expanded their enrollments, even as the size of the population of teenagers is much larger than it once was. So it is much harder to get into college now than it was when I was applying to college in 1998 or 99.
Right.
It's much, much harder, right? Harvard has, again, they got $50 billion or something like that. They have every ability to say, okay, we're going to let in twice as many students as we used to, right? there's a lot more teenagers. We got the money. Let's let them in. But they're never going to do that, right? Because doing so would reduce the relative value of the admission, and they would take a tumble down rankings, right?
And they're already going down in perceived value out in the marketplace, where, you know, people who would have hired them, because people are catching on that they're making these choices not based on whether, as you said, they're not going out and finding the genius. Okay. They're making choices based on optics. They're making choices based on money. There's been grade inflation, and they are not discouraging students from going in and majoring in things that really nobody wants. I mean, it's like, okay, that's, well, you want to come here and study, you know, pick something studies, right? and validate yourself some more for 4 years. But what are you going to sell that for? What is, you know, this whole back to validity, who's going to go out there and validate that with a paycheck?
Right. I mean, the thing is that, you know, there is the social justice and identity-based sort of political line of philosophy in our country right now. There's also a sort of anti-capitalist and socialist sort of line of critique in our country. People who have one tend to endorse the other, but it's important to understand that the social justice identity stuff itself, right, is in fact very cozy with the existing power structure, right? Again,
100%.
it's you know, if you listen to what the people who are actually driving the conversation in that space want, they don't want to upset the apple cart, and they just want more people who look and sound like them to be the ones making millions. And at some point, there has to be an acknowledgement on the left-hand side of the country, to which I belong, that it's just a fundamentally different project, right? To say, let's tear down the systems of inequality and hierarchy, so that we have a more level society and that there's more, you know, true equality for everyone. And I want, you know, queer, BIPOC, trans students to be in Stanford, right? Like those are
Right.
fundamentally different. I need a CEO, a trans CEO in a Fortune 500 company in the next 5 years, or else we riot. Like those are just fundamentally different approaches to the whole thing.
Right. And what I notice is that you know, the people who are really trying to make changes, regardless of where they fall on the sort of political spectrum, or, you know, like you and I might disagree about certain kinds of economic solutions, whatever, but we can have a rational conversation about solutions because we're starting at least living in reality and describing the situation as it actually is, not as, you know, what flatters us or what we sort of wish it would be. And then we're trying to find the areas of common ground. Like, okay, we both want the kids to have true equal opportunity to get the education they want to get, that is, you know, pursues their personal goals and all that, and utilizes the skills and the talents that they have to offer. Okay. How do we best do that? Like you and I could have that conversation, because we're not demonizing the other. We're not sitting there and saying, oh, you are this, you're a bad person, and oh, you're that, you're a bad person. And you just said, you know, I fall on the left of the spectrum. I'm like, okay, but you're brilliant and you have great ideas, and you're analyzing these thoughtfully. And that's all I ever want from a person, is just like, let's talk. And what I'm seeing is, as you said, you know, there's this very cozy relationship with the people pushing the junk into the schools with some big moneymakers, big for-profit corporations, and they have cozy relationships with the government. And I'm trying to call that out and say, guys, this is not capital. Like, this isn't what capitalism is supposed to do. This is like fascism / oligarchy / cronyism. It's, you know, don't defend this. This isn't, it's not social justice, first of all, but it's also not even capitalism. What capitalism was intended to be, if you're talking about the kind where it's voluntary mutual exchange with transparency. This is BS. But we can't have these conversations because people are falling into their tribal, you know, like, I'm a this, well, I'm a that. I can't talk to you because you're a this. And I just don't. And they're doing it to our kids. And the problem I have with that is, adults, you know what? But with a kid has a right to arrive at these things organically, and to be given the opportunity to empirically decide, I like these ideas. Well, wait, I like these ideas, you know? And that's the whole point of America.
Right.
That's why we have freedom of speech.
I mean, the other thing is that, I mean, you know, The problem with sort of saying that you're going to write the dominant group out of the conversation is that the dominant group is dominant, right? Like,
Thank you.
Like, the fact that you can functionally ban certain conservative ideas from Twitter, the fact that those Harvard kids got that completely benevolent and not trying to do any harm panel banned on autism at this Harvard conference, the fact that you can perfectly police like the available range of opinions among the New Yorker staff writers, right? Like that all has created a false sense of power and among people who sort of have this worldview when, the country is still split in thirds, right, between Democrats, Republicans, and people who will never vote. The country is not coherent politically on almost any topic. Like keep us out of wars is probably like one of the most like ones in which people are most consistent and easy to understand, but issue after issue. So abortion is very much in the news right now. And anyone who says, "Oh, the country's mostly pro-life or pro-choice," I don't think that they know what they're talking about because the polling is all very, very confused, right? So, for example, clear majorities of people say that they support the Roe precedent, but they will then also endorse restrictions that are illegal under Roe, right? It happens all the time that people in polls will say, "Oh, yes, I'm fiscally conservative," right? And then they want to expand Medicare and Social Security and say, "Don't cut anything," right?
Exactly. Yeah.
Most people just don't have coherent politics. But right. I think what they absolutely will come together and punish is an attempt to enforce from above a vision of what is and is not permissible in the political sphere by people who don't have a majority of the country behind them. And I think that, I just think it's incredibly short-sighted that people become so convinced by, again, like Twitter is a big part of this, where the entirety of the media and academia classes are on Twitter 24/7. They're addicts, and it's very much not a representative space of the country writ large. And they develop a sense that everybody agrees with them and that their ideas are perfectly mainstream. And sooner or later, they're going to find out that's not true. And I don't know if this impending Roe decision will change things in the fall, but certainly every indication is that we're going to have a bloodbath for Democrats in the midterm election in November. The problem is that I just think that the people who are in this world, their ideas can never fail. They can only be failed. And I don't know that there's any shock to the system that could arrive that can knock them off of their perch and make them see, okay, we need to change our approach fundamentally if we want to survive politically.
Right. I think the New York Times did a piece, and I don't read it because it's behind a paywall, but the headline was something like, Democrats have forgotten rural America or have abandoned rural America. It was something along those lines. And people say all the time, well, who cares? No one lives there, or that's the minority of the population. And they say all these things like, okay, but that may be true, but you're not going, reality, as you pointed out just a few minutes ago, the Senate is the Senate, it's like one per state. You're not going to change that by screaming and yelling and rioting. You're not going to change the fact that the people who grow your food and the people who live in these places are not going to just change what they do or think or anything, never mind how they vote, because you burnt a bunch of buildings down. Like that's not persuasive. And I think the media feeds into that. They're making a lot of money, first of all. And what cracks me up is how many of them are like, oh, terrible, money-making corporations, except for Microsoft and except for Facebook and except for this and except for Pfizer and except for that one. Right. And I'm like, oh, I see. So we're picking our winners and losers based on ideology, but they don't have any principles. They're not really principled about this stuff.
Well, I think that maybe the biggest macro thing that needs to be acknowledged is that, the basic vision that has undergirded the Democratic Party for 40 years, maybe a little less than that, but for a long time, has been the idea that there's an emerging Democratic majority, which is made up of voters of color, and that voters of color are consistent Democrats. And so as the portion of the population grows and grows, the Democratic electoral advantage will grow and grow, and Republicans will be forced either to moderate and to become more like Democrats in their policies, or they'll die. This has not come to pass. And the biggest reason for that is that it turns out that, in fact, voters of color are not born registered Democrats, that they have agency. And so,
shocking.
What's a truly dramatic change in our lifetimes between Barack Obama's presidential election in 2012 and the Biden-Trump election in 2020, Hispanic voters swung to the Republicans by 18 points. Right? Mm-hmm. That's a kind of dramatic change you just don't see in those kind of demographics. And even to a considerably smaller degree, and Black voters are still the most consistent voting bloc, if anything, you can look at being pro-Democrat. Even Black voters, particularly Black men, started to swing towards Trump in 2020 compared to years past. Asian voters have always been much more complicated in terms of their political leanings than anything else. I think we saw in San Francisco when they've rejected the anti-test, anti-algebra, anti-higher math, anti-standards, gifted and talented, etc., where voters rejected that enough, Asian voters in particular rejected that enough to kick out a couple members of the school board. Certainly you can't look at that population and say, oh yeah, these are born Democrats who we can rely on. And so, you get into a scenario where, number one, rural white voters, even though they're a shrinking part of the population, remain an extremely important demographic, particularly given how the electoral college map looks, right? So, an Ohio voter, because of just the way that the map works and what states are reliable and what aren't, their vote is just vastly more valuable for the Democrats than a vote in California, right? So there you've got that. Also, even with the demographic decline, 70% of the electorate is still white. Right. So the country is less white than that. But the electorate, people who have the right to vote, are whether because of felony disenfranchisement, of felons, people who are undocumented, whatever, the 70% of the people who vote, who can't vote, are white. And also, in terms of voting patterns, consistent voters are even more white than that, for a variety of reasons. So, I just think that the Democrats have to get into a position where they're able to sell themselves to people who don't look like them, who don't have a subscription to the New York Times. I don't know if the internal dynamics of the party will allow them to do that. I mean, the party has become captured by an activist class. And people complain, well, you say that, but like, Joe Manchin is still the most powerful person in the party, and still we have a very sort of meek and moderate legislative agenda. And I would say he
only matters because they don't understand people.
Right. But I mean, the thing is like both those things can be true. I mean, this is the point that I've been trying to make for a long time.
That's true. Yeah, that's
true.
That
like the public face of the party can be a very radical, college-educated, urbanite, elite public face, while the legislative apparatus of the party remains beholden to centrists like Manchin and Kristen Sinema. And this is, I would say, the worst of both worlds, right? Because the perception of Democrats is somebody who works for New York Magazine and went to Swarthmore and lives in Williamsburg in Brooklyn, and exactly. And watches all the same shows as the people like them, and has the same vocabulary and the same sort of tired social justice vocabulary, while you don't even get an aggressive legislation agenda out of that, right? So you can't actually deliver to people in their core economic needs because the party is constantly afraid of. I mean, so we had the child tax credit, which was potentially a transformative program, and it cut child poverty by a third in this country, but we only had it for 1 year, and Joe Manchin won't countenance it. So you don't get the voters who might have said, wow, suddenly I'm not in poverty anymore because I have kids and I can pay for, for childcare or whatever. We don't get those voters, but we do also get like people go on Facebook and look on lefty Facebook, and everyone's talking about how whiteness will always be the enemy, whatever. So it's a perception of radicalism without any of the benefits of radicalism.
Right. And I mean, obviously there'll be people who say, yay, like, thank God. But at the same time, I think, as with so many things these days, everything's upside down. If you genuinely want to help people, the people who are in there doing it and dominating the doing of it are doing the opposite of it. And when it comes to education, that's what gets me frustrated, because I look at all of these things and I say, I really care. I really do care about keeping kids out of prison. I really do want kids to go on and have all the doors open to them that they might want open to them based on their abilities and effort. In other words, no arbitrary obstacle in their way to achieve whatever they were capable of. But if you're not going to teach them to read, if that's not like the fundamental thing you're going to work on, forget all the other social justice stuff, all the other equity, all the cosmetic things about how many teachers look like the kid or how many books reflect, people getting beat up by cops or whatever. It's irrelevant because you're not giving them the one thing they need, which is literacy.
Right.
But then I'll be called like, well, you're a racist because you don't want these books and this practice and restorative justice and all this. I'm like, no, I just want what works. And I know we know what works. We have generations of research to show us what actually produces better outcomes.
Right. I mean, the thing that gets me is that there is both a demand that you use that kind of language, those concepts, those texts, etc., and there's still like a vestigial commitment to pretending that you don't have a political bias, right? Like,
I know, right?
It's very strange. It's like I don't have a political bias in my classroom, but I think, because what they always sort of say is, what they believe is outside of politics, right? So if they say, I'm going to teach my kids that it's okay to be trans, and obviously I believe that it's okay to be trans. But if they're going to make that affirmative argument in their classroom, right, and you say, well, that's a sort of lefty idea. It's a political bias that you're showing, and our public school classrooms are supposed to be these neutral spaces, and they'll say, oh, the idea that being trans is okay is not a political idea, right? And the thing is like, it doesn't matter if you are really sure that that's the right position. I'm really sure that's the right position, but I also recognize that it is a inherently deeply political idea, and that parents have something to say about it. I mean, the thing that disturbs me the most about all this stuff is the number of teachers who have been caught saying to their students, don't tell your parents about what we talked about today. And it's like the idea that parents are ever going to be cool with not just the stuff that you might be saying in secret, but the idea that a teacher should feel that they can say to their students, oh, this is just between us and you can't tell your parents. That is going to get at, I mean, that is where the rubber really meets the road. I mean, there's a lot of people who are going to say, like, they'll put the Black Lives Matter sign in their window, and they'll have the, in this house we believe sign out front, and they'll, donate money to the Rainbow Coalition or whatever. But if you fuck with their kid, right? Like if you compel them, if you make them feel that you are in some way endangering the life that you've imagined for your children, the background will be very fierce. And this is one of the things, again, to bring up the San Francisco recall of those school board members, is that it became apparent very quickly that like a lot of people supported it who didn't say so publicly, right? Like people, this is something that happens more and more often, is that when you create this is, the idea in 2016 of the shy Trump voter, right? Why did Trump outperform the polls by so much. One of the theories is just that people don't feel comfortable telling another human being on the phone, I'm voting for Trump. But when they get into the voting booth, they can just pull that lever and do it anonymously. And I think it's the same way with this shit, where like I just think that there's a lot of quote unquote conservatism that's going to emerge from people when this stuff really, I mean, like, so again, with these Asian American parents who, not just in San Francisco, but all across the country, are leading the charge against shuttering gifted and talented programs. They're, or making it impossible to take algebra in 8th grade, which is something that they've done in some places, which in turn makes it almost impossible for them to take calculus in high school, which in turn makes it really hard to be attractive to colleges. These parents are saying, like, they're not, generally speaking, registered Republicans, but they're saying, look, I came here to work my ass off to give my kid the opportunity to flourish academically and then climb the ladder. And you're trying to pull the rug out from under me and you're calling it equity. And I'm not going to let that happen. And I think you're really going to see a lot of that stuff coming up.
Yeah. Well, I think too that people have taken the words like liberal and conservative, and they don't really mean anything anymore. Yeah. And, so like, that's why I said they don't understand people, because there's nothing, it just doesn't mean what they say it means. They're focusing on things that aren't going to help people. So a liberal, let's say, who really genuinely wants to, allow people opportunities and uplift or whatever, if that's their thing, they're going to look at it and say, but it's not. You're closing doors, you're slamming doors, it's not working, the kids are not learning, et cetera. And then if you're more conservative, you're saying, you want to persuade me to say it's okay to be trans, or say, abortion, whatever it is you want to say. But here's the thing, the way you're presenting it to my kid is not just it's okay, but you're saying that to my 5-year-old. So in other words, you're not even taking into account age appropriateness of your message. Right. And you're introducing topics and introducing them in a sort of dark way, or in a way where, like you said, where don't tell mom and dad. So it's the way they're going about doing it, as opposed to just allowing it to evolve through discussion. You can have a Socratic conversation, for example, with middle school or high school kids, where you present some pretty controversial topics. And as long as the teacher doesn't project their view into the kids and says, well, some people think this and some people think, let's talk about it. You could do that. And I actually believe there are conservative parents who would be like, it's public school, it's America. I'm not going to vent my spleen over if you brought up Marxism in the classroom. Okay. But it's when the teacher goes, this is the only right way, and everybody else is a racist, and they hang a flag of the Soviet Union or something like that. Right. And let's all pray to Angela Davis. That's when people get twitchy and say, I was willing to go there with you as long as you were just having a conversation, but now you're like, this is the way.
Right. Yeah. I mean, the thing is, I think it's important to say is, like, particularly, a lot of the stuff emerges from education departments at colleges and universities. I took a lot of education. Well, I did a lot of stuff in the sort of education world at Purdue when I was getting my PhD. It's really hard to go through such a program and not be a relentlessly social justice focused person. Even before 2020, so I graduated from my PhD program in 2015. Even before George Floyd and 2020 and Black Lives Matter and the explosion in interest in trans rights and Me Too and all this stuff, the pressure to be the most woke person in your program, especially when you're on the job market, was enormous. In almost all of these jobs now, they have this requirement that one of the things that you write as part of your application is a diversity statement. And that diversity statement, for every practical purpose, must reflect, whiteness is a force in the universe that causes all of these problems. Men are inherently patriarchal. Like queerness is the antidote to the virus of heterosexuality. Those are extreme versions, but that stuff is stuff I heard all the time. Getting a PhD in the humanities in the 2010s, that vision of politics is mandated if you're going to get these jobs. Right. It is just unthinkable to go through that process where there are, 1,000 applicants for every job. right? Where the conditions are brutal, where you're making terrible money, whether you're a PhD student still or a postdoc, where you're desperate to get a job doing anything that you can to get your foot in the door. It's just, you cannot sit down and write an essay and say, well, I think diversity is important, but I think the definition of diversity in the academy is actually kind of messed up. And I actually think that we're trying to enforce a certain vision of diversity. You will never see the inside of a faculty office ever, right? Yeah, there's just, and you go to again, this was 7 or 8 years ago now, but you go to conferences and every panel is about some aspect of social justice, and every award goes to a candidate who can represent themselves as a diversity, as increasing diversity for the award, and is doing a paper about social justice. I mean, it is a completely hegemonic space. And so, there just isn't any such thing as like a dissident who comes out of an education graduate program. What you do have is you have people who want to be public school teachers. And so what they do is they grit their teeth for, 3 years of masters and until they get their certification. And then they can go and be public school teachers and actually live their actual politics. But the experience of people in teacher training programs, just learning never to challenge anything because it's just not worth the hassle and time and heartache, I think is just core to the whole profession.
Yep, absolutely. And I mean, I feel like I'm living proof. I went to University of Pennsylvania 1989-90, graduated 90 with my master's degree. And they were having us read Paulo Freire. And I remember my professor saying, teaching is a political act, and you're going into the classroom to be an activist for social justice. And this is in 89. And I remember thinking, wow, that's not what I thought I was doing. I mean, I guess if I thought about it, I thought, well, sure, I'm going to make sure these kids are literate so then they can vote. I'm going to make sure they're numerate so they can vote. I mean, like the whole thing was, I get it. Yeah, we can't really have a responsible voting population and maintain our freedom if people can't participate. But that's as far as my brain took it, right? But by the end of the program, it was made sort of clear to me, no, it's really meant to be these specific ideas. And then once I went out into the classroom, that was drilled into my brain even further by union members, like you have to join the union. You did then, you don't now. And I left because I couldn't work that way. I wouldn't work that way. I was like, I'm not that kind of person. I can't work in that environment where I have to think and fall in line and toe the line. That wasn't going to be my life. So I left.
Paulo Freire is interesting for reference for me because completely independent of like the specific political considerations of his work, right? I just think he's a terribly overrated thinker and not a very good writer. And I think Pedagogy of the Oppressed, I think, is just a one long laundry list of cliches after another. And that's like, that is my engagement with the text as a thinker and as a person. And it is not in any sense like, oh, I reject this woke garbage. It's that I don't like, I think that everything that he said was something that had been said before. And that to the extent that he had any, his actual practical implications for how to be a teacher were totally impractical for almost anyone in the teaching profession. And yet, and you're supposed to be, I mean, a big part of grad school is, learning to think and write critically. But he's the kind of person that you don't criticize, right? Like I definitely would not have criticized Gloria Anzaldúa or Bell Hooks either when I was in my PhD program, which, is kind of contrary to the whole idea of the thing, but whatever.
So why are you in graduate school if you're not supposed to be having, if you're not supposed to be challenging things and thinking? You're not there to just repeat or regurgitate what somebody just said. I mean, and then what happens is the pipeline for teaching is full of people who've come out of colleges, well, all the way at this point now, kindergarten through 12th grade, college and grad school maybe, where they've been taught that the highest value is to be approved of by your supposedly better, more intelligent, professors. And that's what you do. It's a kind of hero worship. It's not, which feels quasi-religious. There's something about the way I see teachers, if you talk about TikTok teachers, for example, the ones who are like, I am doing this. It's very dogmatic, and it feels like it just feels like religious ritual to
Yeah.
me.
I mean, look, I joined the field that has several names, but the one that I prefer is just writing studies. And particularly, I had an interest in empirical research and quantitative research. I still do. And I did because I had been told that that was a place that student writing is really taken seriously. And what I discovered very quickly is that was not true. I wanted to write about classroom techniques that might improve scores on writing tests, and looking at, correlating things, for example. What I found was that in the field, the research that was getting celebrated and published was like the rhetoric of Doctor Who was absolutely incomprehensible theory papers that I just, speaking as someone who reads, who's read a lot of theory and is very conversant in a lot of stuff, I would just have no idea what was being argued or why it would.
And you're like, I'm paying for this. This is awesome.
Yeah. I was, a big set of things. Video games have become very big in the field because you could get kids to sign up for classes that had video games in the title, and they really needed enrollments. And so you had a lot of people who would sort of come out right out and say, "Oh, I play video games," and call it research. But the actual quality of their output, the intellectual quality, was nil. And tons and tons and tons of social justicey stuff about how we don't respect Black bodies in three-dimensional space or whatever the fuck, right, that people wanted to come up with. There was just no. So one of the things that happened when I was, I ended up taking a ton of classes in applied linguistics and in education, and sort of applying my interest there because I just had found nothing of value to me in my own field. And to their credit, my professors were very supportive of me doing whatever I wanted to do. But at some point when I was, really disillusioned, I started to sort of ask around, like, what is a piece of new knowledge that has been generated in this field recently, right? What is something that we know to be true that we didn't know to be true 20 years ago? Nobody said the same things, right? Well, to the degree that anyone said anything that was the same, it would always be some version of, well, we're racist and sexist, and the academy is the patriarchy. But the only things that people would share would be that. But there was absolutely nothing. There was literally nothing that they could point to, like, okay, how students write and the skills they absorb and what works the best in the college writing classroom, which, was the pretext under which these departments or these programs are funded by the universities, right? Is they say, these programs have tended to split off from English departments by telling the universities, English departments don't give a shit about writing. They're so caught up in their weird theory and stuff like that, and the professors don't want to teach writing anyway, so we'll take over that. But then they just do the same thing happens because the coin of the realm in the academy is being as abstract and unconnected to practicality as possible, and so we just we weren't researching anything, and it's unthinkable that you could go to a bunch of biology people and say, what new knowledge do we have 20 years ago? And they wouldn't come up with anything, right? Like they would be able to rattle off a list of things that they know that they didn't know before. It's the same in computer science or engineering, whatever. And even in more sort of softer sciences, I do believe, for all the problems with the p-value crisis, et cetera, in psychology, they would be able to tell us things that they had discovered that they think are true about the mind that we didn't know before. So that was, but again, like, if I had been willing, if I had been able to live with myself, if I had just banged the social justice drum, if I had just played the role and I had been a good boy and not published constantly on criticisms of the social justice movement, I would have been able to get a tenure track job, and I'd be there right now, and I'd have tenure, and I would produce every once in a while, I'd produce a meaningless article that maybe 5 people would read ever, and enjoy a very comfortable life.
Right. And I think that's a really good place to start to wrap up, because you've now got your Substack, which I hope all of you watching will subscribe to. It's fantastic. It is Freddie deBoer, which is, you know, his name. And what I love about it is there's just always, you're always asking questions or looking at things and just saying what you think is true. So what you just said about, you know, what do you know now that we know is true that we didn't know before? You're one of the people I love to read because you make me think. And I think that is what a lot of people are craving right now. I think there really are a lot of people who are, it's like music to just hear someone say something true, because we're getting very cynical. I mean, it's like propaganda. We know we're being lied to by just about everybody in mainstream media. So when I go to your Substack, I'm like, yes, that's a true statement. You know, like I can't disagree with that. Or even the things that I might look at a little differently, I'm like, he's telling me truth in terms of just being blunt. In other words, you're not sugarcoating things, and I don't feel like you're in service to any agenda. And it's absolutely refreshing. So that's something that I think I'm hoping that you know, by virtue of, you know, looking at your success and everything, that gives me hope. That tells me there are people out there that want this, and that's good, because if we can keep that intellectual activity going, and if we can remind ourselves that that's what we need to give our kids, we need to give our kids the same degree of curiosity and real critical thinking, not the critical, like take it all apart thinking. We have a chance. At least that's what I think. What do you think?
Thanks. I hope you're right. And I really appreciate that. And I appreciate you having me on.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for coming and spend this time with us. And I hope you have a fantastic rest of your day and weekend. And this will be up on replay. And thank you, everybody, for coming. Please like, share, and comment. Have a great day.
Thanks.